Hi, I'm Andrew Torgett with Texas History for Teachers. During the 30 years that followed the Civil War and Reconstruction, Texas underwent a dramatic transformation. Between 1870 and 1900, a flood of new people poured into the state, nearly tripling the population and pushing settlements farther and farther west. A huge new industry in Texas cattle emerged during this time, bringing with it the fabled era of the cowboy and the cattle drive. And at the exact same time, thousands of miles of new railroad lines began crisscrossing the state, leading to a boom in cotton farming and connecting Texans in ways never before possible. Now, that all sounds exciting, but this was also an era of tremendous conflict. That flood of new settlers, for example, produced fights with Native Americans that eventually led to war. The great wealth produced by cattle drives also led to vicious battles over who controlled the best land and water. And although the expansion of railroads helped Texas farmers produce more cotton, those farmers, as it turned out, got poorer every year, and many lost their land. So the question is, how could all of these different things be happening all at once? And what did that mean for Texas? Well, let's start with that flood of people moving into the state. After the Civil War, poor farmers, both black and white, often came to Texas because it had really cheap land, about 50 cents an acre, which was less than half of what land costs pretty much anywhere else. The state's population, as a result, doubled in only 10 years, going from 800,000 people in 1870 to 1.6 million by 1880. 10 years after that, it had nearly doubled again to 2.2 million. And then, by 1900, it reached 3 million. That's a lot of people. And many of those new people kept going west and settled near the plains, where they came into conflict with the last of the American Indian tribes living in Texas. The U.S. Army also moved out west to establish new forts, and by the mid-1870s, a war erupted between groups like the Comanche, Apache, and Kiowa and the United States military. In what became known as the Red River War, the U.S. Army hunted down Comanche leader Kawana Parker and the last bands of American Indians on the Texas plains, finally forcing the tribes to surrender and sending them to live on reservations in modern-day Oklahoma. The removal of groups like the Comanches, as it turned out, opened the Plains territory for a new era of cattle drives. After the Civil War, the price for beef rose dramatically in places like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, which meant that a cow that cost only $3 in Texas could be worth $40 or $50 in New York City. And so many Texans began rounding up cattle and driving them to the railroad lines in Kansas, where they could be sold for top dollar. Before long, huge profits from these cattle drives led to the creation of massive new ranches in Texas, like the famous King Ranch in South Texas and the XIT Ranch that covered 3 million acres in the Texas Panhandle. But these mega ranches also started stringing up barbed wire to protect their herds and to control access to water, which made it harder for anyone else to drive cattle across the plains. And so the era of the famous cattle drives ended almost as quickly as it began. And by the 1890s, many Texas ranchers began using the state's rapidly expanding railroad lines to ship their cattle to market. At the same time all of that was going on, most of the millions of people moving into Texas were not ranchers. They were farmers, and they were growing cotton. And as it turned out, they were having a really, really hard time. You see, as more and more people grew cotton, and the supply of cotton continued to go up, the price that farmers could get paid for that cotton began to go down. Cotton went from around 16 cents a pound in 1869 down to 10 cents a pound in 1880, all the way down to only 5 cents a pound by 1894. The price just kept dropping every single year. And that meant that farmers just kept getting poorer and poorer every single year. Before long, many of them could no longer afford to pay for their homes, and they began losing their land. In desperation, these farmers asked the state government for help, but the state's leaders at the time refused to do much of anything, which left the farmers in a terrible situation. So what did those farmers do? They rebelled. In 1892, they revolted, and they formed their own political party called the People's or the Populist Party. The idea was to seize political power for themselves so that they could help farmers and really change things in Texas and the United States. And what's most remarkable is that they very nearly succeeded. And so by 1900, Texas had become a very different place than it had been in 1870. Which means that the question we must ask ourselves is, how was it that cotton farmers, the cattle industry, and the great expansion of railroads could together change so much in the state?